Hello and welcome to MIP TV. And with me, as always, is the bookworm extraordinaire, and he's Bob Cook, and he's going to be reviewing a brand new book in this episode, and it's called Core Competencies of Relational Psychoanalysis by Roy Barnes.
Correct.
And it's brand new, isn't it? It came out in April of 2018. So what tittles you fancy with this particular tome, Bob?
Okay, so this book is for students of counselling, therapy, psychoanalysis, and people really interested in what makes up a competent practitioner. So, for example, we need to, whatever level, whether it's counselling level, whether it's psychotherapy level, whether it's psychoanalysis level, we need to have some measure, if you like, on our effectiveness. You know, at our institute, for example, in the second year, we do clinical competencies, where people who are practicing to be psychotherapists have to get evaluated by the Manchester Institute to say, yes, we'll allow them out as beginning practitioners so they can go on to placements. So I'm sure there's something like that in the counselling world, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, we usually call it, when I taught it was called fitness to practice. We used to call it a fitness to practice letter, or we would have what we call a letter of comfort to our colleagues in training establishments to say that we were happy as practitioners to allow our students out, you know, at student level. Yeah.
So there must have been some criteria in terms of fitness to practice.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. We would use we would give them a kind of scale, and we'd use the Kharkov rating scales.
Wow.
Which were very popular. Of course, Kharkov was a compadre of Rogers, one of Rogers' students.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'd use the Kharkov rating scales for empathy and unconditional positive regard, and we would mark them on that. Yeah.
Yeah. So in transaction analysis, you would look for similar things like empathy, how to stay behind the client, how to make a TA contract. You know, so we had 11 or 12 competencies, how to work with child ego state. So we look for similar sort of things, because if we're going to help people on the road to be professional psychotherapists, and same in your line, counsellors, we needed to make sure they could do the job, they were effective and ethical. Ethical is a really big one. And what I like about this book is the new relational psychoanalysis movement, and it is new, because if you go back to the Freud, Jung, and those days of psychoanalysis, it was very much around, you know, the sense of a neutral psychoanalyst, an authoritarian place where they would use free association, they use interpretation. So you're very much, the analyst was the authority, the person who was actually making the interpretation.
Had all the power. Yeah.
Correct. Nowadays, 100 years later, we have the birth, since about 1990, of what we would call the relational turn. So in other words, as we probably talked about in earlier books, the research shows that the relationship and awareness of the relationship is the curative factor.
Yes.
You know, whatever model we use, really. Big research models like Northcross have come out and said this. So that sort of era, moving away from such an emphasis on models to the idea of relationship being the curative factor, has been very, very important in the humanistic field and psychoanalysis. So we've seen a movement away from the Freudian idea of the authoritarian interpreter of cure and health to intersubjectivity, co-creation, and relationship being at the heart and focus of change.
Yes, absolutely. And if anybody's watching this and they want to have a look at the other books, we talked about Hagenden and Sills, who kind of really wrote the book on relational psychotherapy, I think. And I've talked a lot about what's called the Dodo verdict, which is this research that was done 100 years ago, believe it or not, by Saul Schwagenden, I think. And he basically said that, that all psychotherapies are equal, hence the Dodo bird. It was the quality of the relationship, and that's been played out by Lucy Goldsmith recently, who did a PhD at Manchester with the same outcome. So, yeah, so this book really is in that tradition then, isn't it? The tradition of relational psychotherapy.
Yeah, and I really like the book in terms of many of the chapters talking about the change from the Freudian, Jungian ideas that I've just been talking about to the much more contemporary, where psychoanalysts get off the couch, sit, chair to chair, and there's a huge emphasis. Rogers was the same. Huge emphasis on actually the intersubjective, the co-creation of the two people. I very much enjoyed that, because I think there's still a myth, maybe I'm wrong here, but I still think there's a myth of psychoanalysis being much more like the Freudian story.
Yes, someone maybe with a bit of a Van Dyke beard and a German accent saying, "Tell me about your mother." That type of stereotype.
Yeah. So and I was fascinated in this book on the competencies which this person's put together with the help of some other people, that they look for in the what makes an effective trainee in the psychoanalysis movement. And I was really, really fascinated that it's not far from the principles that we look for in the humanistic models. So let me just read the 8 principles out to you. First one, therapeutic intent / purpose. In other words, when we sit down with clients, what's the purpose? What are we actually doing there? What is the therapeutic intent? What are you actually doing? So, for example, in transaction analysis, there's an emphasis on contracts, on working out all the information that we can get to have the therapeutic contract. So we've got a sense of ruddering, if you like, so we know when the person has achieved their contract. Now, in the relational school, it's very much about the analyst getting all the information of the unconscious and conscious mind in that therapeutic intent. So I thought it was really interesting. Number 2, therapeutic stance and attitude. So there we have a really big change now from, if you go back 100 years ago, the therapeutic stance or the analyst stance or the analyst's attitude was authoritarian, neutral, making interpretation. Nowadays, the emphasis on curiosity, co-creation, self-engagement, and the building of a co-created relationship. What a difference.
Yeah.
And I like number 2 particularly, because in Rogers, now you're the person I bow to on the Rogers process.
Don't bow, Bob. Don't do that.
He was really talking about all those things.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, Rogers was the person who kind of founded that approach, and interestingly enough, he trained in psychoanalysis.
There we are.
Yeah.
So he would be applauding these, wouldn't he?
He would. He would be applauding them, and he would. I would imagine, knowing him through the literature, he'd be very happy. Modalities take that on. Yeah.
Yeah. Number 3, then. This is fantastic. I come from the integrative school, where there's a huge focusing on what I'm going to say now. Number 3, deep listening and attunement.
Absolutely.
What a marvelous competency. So it's miles away, isn't it, from the authoritarian approach of the psychoanalysts in Freud's day.
Oh, absolutely. And I've always used to say to my students when I taught, there's a big difference between listening to someone and hearing them.
Oh, Roy, you couldn't have said anything better. Yeah, absolutely. They're 2 different things, aren't they? Hearing them and listening to them. You have people listening to you and never hear you.
Yeah.
So deep listening and attunement.
Yes.
I love that. Next, 4, a concentration on the there and then and the here and now. In other words, when you're actually evaluating a relational psychoanalyst, you need to make sure that they actually link the connections between the two, because in a developmental model, you've got that whole emphasis of back there is the template for what's happening here and now. So what they do when they talk about these competencies is that this is done in the intersubjective relationship. Now, that's what we look for. We look for exactly the same in the humanistic process. 5 is patterning and linking, looking for connections. 6 is what we would call games in transaction analysis, looking for repetitive compulsion and how those repeated patterns play out in the present. Number 7, now I love this, courageous speech and disciplined spontaneity.
That's
How's
good,
that for how's that?
Yeah.
Courageous speech and disciplined spontaneity. Get your head around that then.
Yeah, well, I mean, I used to say to my learners, you know, the famous Maya Angelou quote, without courage, you cannot practice any virtue consistently.
Yeah.
Without courage, you cannot practice any other virtue consistently.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah,
wonderful. And I think what a wonderful competency. And disciplined spontaneity.
Yes.
What does that mean? Of course, that means that you think before you're spontaneous. I know it's a paradox, if you like.
Yes.
You know, but you need to think about spontaneity. In other words, you need to think about your transactions. You need to think about how come you said that then and why.
Yes. Yes. I mean, it's sometimes referred to as immediacy. And it's the same. It's the same thing. It's just that you have a feeling or a thought that comes up, you want to share it with the client, but as before it comes out of the mouth, you just run it past the brain.
Yeah, you run it past the brain. Yeah,
yes.
That's right. You run it past the brain. So I love the word discipline, spontaneity.
It's a good phrase. That yeah.
Discipline, spontaneity, and finally, the evaluation of the effective relational psychoanalyst is love.
Yes.
In other words, that the analyst needs to take their heart, soul, and spirit in a loving way into the co-created relationship.
Yeah, absolutely, Bob. And there's a wonderful book. I know we talk about this one, but there's a great book called The Art of Loving by Eric Fromm. You can pick up really cheaply on eBay. Fantastic book, all about the different forms of love that humans are able to project and receive. Really, really good. Really good.
That's a book to perhaps do later on.
Yeah, we could do that. Yeah,
I did it ready years and years. I don't quite remind it, but I think it's so important that if you are going to evaluate a practitioner, humanistic or relational psychoanalysis in this list, what a wonderful competency to be able to take your heart, spirit, and soul into therapeutic discourse.
Absolutely. And doesn't the last topic, bringing love into the relationship, really, really speak of that intersubjective, deep connection where the work's done, Bob?
I think it's the heart of it, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
If I'm watching these beginning therapists or beginning counselors and they aren't able to open up their heart, you know, what are we saying to the people in front of us?
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, and I think that list is a wonderful list. And in the 8 chapters, they take each one of those competencies and break them down and talk about them. And it's such a wondrous book in terms of looking at the nuances, if you like, of have a template for when you go forward, whatever level practitioner. I mean, this book is fantastic in terms of these competencies and what is needed, I think, for effective work.
Yeah, I can hear your enthusiasm about the book, and I think everybody should buy it. From what you've told me, I think everybody should have a copy. I think it should be definitely in training libraries.
I probably, as a loving act, I will probably buy 2 of these copies and put them in my libraries for my students.
Yeah,
as a loving gesture and as a model for beginning therapists or counselors to embrace their heart and show it within the therapeutic relationship, instead of so often these beginning therapists, I understand, I did this myself, tighten up my heart because there's an emphasis in the United Kingdom and certainly in the United States on defensive psychotherapy.
Oh yeah, but that's a whole different video, Bob, isn't it? But yeah, absolutely. And and within that kind of opening your heart up, you are taking a risk. It asks practitioners to take risks in terms of being vulnerable and opening themselves up. And I think it's one of those things that's like a bit of a fine wine. It matures with age, Bob.
It does, yeah. In a book we reviewed, I think it was the 14th or 15th book, and it was called "The Risk of Relatedness."
Yes. Yes.
Exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
The risk to take love and open your heart takes a lot of courage. That's why I like this other competency.
Yes.
Takes a lot of courage to do. And most of all, and I really talk about this a lot, and I know you do. I know it's very close to your heart. That the beginnings, throughout people's journeys, I think they need to have their own therapy, be able to look at their countertransference, because this is not easy stuff we're talking about.
No, and I concur completely with that people need to access their own therapy and kind of be really honest with themselves and look at themselves, and kind of do the work, because it's as big a part, I think, therapy, a personal therapy, it's as big a part of training as actually getting involved in the meta model and learning the skills.
100%. We do within our training group process, that's 4 hours.
Yes.
Of this whole process we're talking about here. And sadly, many centers in transaction analysis community anyway, because that's what I can speak of most,
yes,
have or don't really include group process so much, if at all, in the trainings of psychotherapy. And I think it's a great shame, because I follow your dictate there. The more we know ourselves as a reflective practitioner, the more we can model this without these defensive processes in the therapeutic process. So I couldn't agree more.
Well, I mean, I think it's been a wonderful conversation, Bob. I've really enjoyed hearing about this, mainly because I think that the book is modality free, as you said earlier. It fits any modality of therapy you want to practice in terms of building a relational connection with a client.
Yes, modality free,
yeah. So it's Core Competencies of Relational Psychotherapy. It's by Roy Barnes.
Yeah, relational psychoanalysis, because part of this, not for psychotherapy, but because it's such an emphasis on the move away from the early classic psychoanalysis to the more relational, subjective psychoanalysis. And that's what I think is fantastic, because I go around so much and people think of psychoanalysis and the more older view of interpretation, free association, authoritarian stance. But relational psychoanalysis, which is more what we're talking about, is this wonderful, wonderful sense of connection and heart within a therapeutic relationship.
Well, everybody should at least have a look at the book. We'll put a link in the comments bar below. Click on it and have a look. And you can see it. As always, Bob doesn't get paid for these book reviews. He does it clearly, as you can see, for the love of it. And we'll see you in the next book review. So, Bob Cook, thank you very much.
You certainly will, Roy. Bye-bye.